So that started your career out with Jeff, amongst many other drummers. So let's talk a little bit more about Jeff and working with him, and you know, how was it?
It was great. He became my best friend, and he taught me a lot. Very fair, very giving guy. He lent me $10,000 home, and he told me that Boz lent him $10,000 to buy his home. And a year later, I'm buying my home, and he lends me the $10,000.
Wow, that's
and I ended up lending that $10,000 to my friend Porcupine, Cliff Jones, who has a vintage guitar business, amps and stuff in LA. So it's the karma thing, you know, what goes around comes around, and you know, it tended to help me, and it helped Porcupine, I call him, and you know, and the band plays something.
Yeah. So Jeff calls you and says, "Hey, I've got a studio gig. It's going to go most of the day, and I need this gear." So how did your typical day go for the next day with the gear?
I would call in to R&R's Cartage Company, tell them which drum kit, and like I said, they'd deliver. I would set up, get everything ready, and the guy was always early. I mean, the guy was never late a day in his life. So I had to be there extra early.
Sure.
You know,
you want to be there before him.
I wanted to be ready for him when I walked in. And, I mean, we were like good friends. I mean, he was a football fan. I got Raider season tickets. We went to probably 20 football games. We went to the Super Bowl, at the Rose Bowl, the Dolphins and the Washington Redskins. And then he's told me they're going into Studio 55 to record Total. So I had his kit brought down, and I brought my Gretsch kit and a bunch of my snare drums. And I mean, I can't say that he had never played Gretsch drums before, but he was with Ludwig at the time.
Right.
And they were they were the best drums money could buy.
Yeah.
And he heard it on tape, and he loved it. And he used my drums on the first Total album. I had, at that point, I got a 26-inch thermal glass Ludwig bass drum.
You finally got your 26-inch bass.
Finally. And that's the bass drum used on Hold the Line. If you listen, the bass drums were, you know, a little different on that particular track. And a bunch of my snare drums. I had the chain pedals that Frank Capolito in New York, his guy Al Duffy.
Right.
And they took old Gretsch and Camco pedals and they put the chain on there. Well, back then that was rocket science.
Sure, everything was just a strap-driven pedal.
Or Ludwig Speed.
Yeah, which is kind of a direct drive in a way. But
right. No, and then the Ghost pedal came out. People were like, wow, look at this. You know. My buddy Alex Van Halen has about 50 of them.
Yeah.
That's his pedal.
Sure, no, people love that pedal. Yeah.
Hey, it's like Charlie Watts had 100 speed keys. You know?
Yeah.
So anyways, I had that, and Ochiltree turned me on all this stuff. And he had a Pro Mark hi-hat.
Oh, sure.
And it was a chain on the bottom of the foot pedal with double springs on the outside. And this at the time was, you know, it was like full on like race car, like Indy 500.
Yeah, unlike anything else that was on the market.
Top fuel dragster shit compared to all the other stuff. And I'm turning Jeff on this. He's like, yeah, well, cool, man. Then I got into building my snare drums. And that happened. I had a friend, Robbie Lawrence was his name. And he was a guitar player, guitar historian, guitar fag. I mean, I don't know what other word to describe it. And I love, don't get me wrong.
Yeah.
And he wrote an article for Guitar Player magazine every month called Rare Bird. And every month, it's the 57 Stratocaster, and he'd write this whole article about the guitar. Then he did the Les Paul Sunburst guitar. So at the end of his article, he wrote in these guitars has sold for as much as $2,000 because he sold one of his to Peter Frampton. And at the time, Frampton was out with Frampton Comes Along.
Oh, huge.
Yeah. The next day, the West Paul Sunburst was $2,000. They're $265 when they're new, and they're about $500 to $600, and all of a sudden they're $2,000. So he taught me a lot about guitars. Solid bodies, the different woods, why it sounds this way. And I remember, and I would stay at his house because I was in between tours, and back then tours were 6 weeks. And all of a sudden you got 2 weeks off. Well, I didn't have an apartment. So I stayed at my friends, and I'd make sure there was beer in the fridge, and I had a bag of weed to smoke, and
We're good for 2 weeks, right?
Yeah, then I'm gone. Like Bob said, he says, I did my best to be the perfect guest. I knew when to go. So anyways, I'll never forget, one day we're at his house, and he says, oh, I got a rental at Sunset Sound. Do you want to go with me? I'm like, sure. And he lived at Laurel Canyon and Sunset. We walked on the Sunset. We took the bus to Sunset Sound. He had his cherry red 335 with him. Oh, I'm here in the studio too. They buzzed us and we walk in, and it's B.B. King. And he rented B.B. his 335. And here's the glass. We're sitting on a couch, and B.B.'s where the mic stand is, blowing solos for an hour. And he made $50 so that B.B. King used his guitar. And I'm thinking, ding. Yeah. So
that's kind of what really kind of got you thinking, hey, I'm going to start my studio rental.
Well, no, there's money to be made.
Sure.
And it's funny how I actually fell into that, because a very dear friend of mine I met in 1975 at the Bottom Line in New York. And I was there with John Guerin with LA Express. And his name's Gerry Brown.
Oh, legendary drummer,
Monster.
Gerry Brown.
And he was with Larry Coryell. And we became really good friends and everything. And I kept telling him, you gotta move out to LA, you gotta move out to LA. And then he did Stanley Clark School Days. It was kind of a jazz rock, confusion rock, smoking record. Great band, a 4-piece horn section and stuff. So I hung out with them a bunch. And Stanley was with Chick Corea. And the 4-piece band with Lenny White and Al Di Meola broke up. And they did an album called Music Magic. And it had a 5-piece horn section. Joe Farrell played or tenor.
Sure.
And Chick's girlfriend, Gail Moran, she was like classical keyboard player, singer. She was in the band. So anyway, short, straight, long, they worked, they were going to record at Caribou Ranch outside Denver. And it was Jim Guercio, who was Chicago's producer and stuff. And he made this studio on this ranch outside of Denver, and the idea was you go there, got all your friends hanging out, there's no strip joints, and you can get work done and
get it done,
stay there.
right, yeah.
And stay there. It was a beautiful place. So Jerry played North drums at the time. Remember the ones that went like this?
Those are loud drums, aren't they?
No, and they're cool drums live, but this isn't studio stuff. So Chick's manager told me, he said, go to the rental companies and rent a drum set. So I went to SIR and Professional and Royal, and they were the big cartage companies at the time. And the studio thing was wailing in LA at the time. And they had drums, but these rental places, the bulk of their money they made off of keyboards.
Oh, interesting.
So they would have drums, because people come and they need everything.
Sure.
They have bass amps and guitars and stuff. And they'd have drum sets, and I'm looking at the drum sets, and they weren't maintained. The heads were all beat in, they're missing lugs. It's
kind of like an afterthought for the rental company.
Exactly.
We got a drum set for you. Here you go.
Exactly. So, ding, the light bulb goes out of my head, and I had an ulterior motive. And I said to Chick's manager, I said, look, I got this beautiful set of lovely drums in my parents' basement in Detroit. I said, if you pay to ship them to Colorado, you can use them on the album. My angle, and I'm not a drummer anymore, was I'll get my drums to LA, and I have to sell the shit to pay my rent. At least they're here.
Right. Yeah.
So that's my aim. She's like, great. We'll give you an album credit, the whole thing, by the way. One of my first album credits. So they do the recording, everything's great. I drive the truck back from Denver to
Sure,
LA
sure,
with
yeah,
my
yeah.
drums in the back. And a week later, Bernie Kirsch was his name, was the engineer. He calls me up and goes, "Hey, Jamo, those drums sounded great." He goes, "I'm doing the Emotions with Maurice White
Yeah,
at Hollywood Sound. Can I rent those drums from you?"
there it is,
And I'm
right?
like, "Yeah, $200 a week." Yeah, for 3 weeks, I made $600. I paid $550 for the drums when I bought them brand new. And my mother told me I was a fool for not spending that $550 to go to college.
Yeah, yeah.
And I went to college for 1 year, and it was go to college or go to Vietnam. And they already had my brother over there, so so I went to college. And this is 1974.
Mm-hmm.
So, boom, I got this drum kit. And from what Robbie Lawrence had taught me about the guitars, I started looking at vintage drums. And I noticed, they're solid maple shells. A lot of them are mahogany, but the higher end stuff, solid maple shells instead of plywood, like the
Sure.
Gretsch and Ludwig and whatever was being popular at the time. This is before the Japanese companies kind of came in.
So this is the mid-70s, and so at
Yeah.
that point, the snare drum to have, in no particular order, was a Ludwig Supraphonic, Rogers Dynasonic,
Exactly.
Deeper snare drums starting to become popular, Ludwig Acrolite, Slingerland Magnum, these deep drums, big lugs. So at that time, no one's interested in old snare drums from the 20s and 30s and 40s. Everything's escalating to big drums, loud drums, big cymbals.
Right.
So you're thinking in a totally different direction. Hey, these older drums have a sonic quality, I'm assuming here, and so you're getting these old drums, you're looking at them, and then you're starting to modify them? Tell us
Yes.
about that a little bit.
Well, Aquiltree taught me. I remember he took me in New York City to SR into Billy's locker. And he had, and I'll never forget, it was downstairs in the basement. And he had fiber cases stacked up, walnut Gretsch, maple Gretsch, and they're all Gretsch drums. And he was sponsored by Fives at the time. And he had a couple Fives kits. And I asked him, what's the story of the Gretsch? This is before I got with Jeff.
Yeah.
And he told me the hoop, the rim. And he showed me how it's a die-cast rim. So I started, I bought up some of these radio cakes. So I refinished them.
So this is one of them here. So this is a radio kit.
This is actually my best one that I kept. I
This is your
sold
best
almost
drum.
all of them.
Wow. So let me pull up an original Radio King. And let's just kind of let everybody see. So, a lot of these old drums, and you can talk about it as well. The strainers weren't made for modern music, right? Did they work well?
No, not at all.
Yeah. So,
Halfway through the song, it would loosen up and come off,
yeah. And you got these hoops, right, which are thin and they ring a lot probably.
They call them stick eaters. And it's actually, it's a brass hoop. And it's a good hoop. It's just, they're not, I don't know, flange is the right word, but it's bent over like this.
Right.
So these would just chew up the sticks.
Mm-hmm.
You just, the toothpicks would be
Right,
flying
yeah,
off
you're
the
going through a lot of
when you're
sticks.
playing.
And the butt plate was usually the same as the strainer or
Right.
very non-adjustable. So you would take an old drum like this and you'd make some modifications.
Right.
So show us some of the modifications
Well,
you
what I
here.
did back then, I used Rogers throw-offs.
Mhm.
And there was a good throw-off and a good tension, and the Rogers butt plate. This is before people started, you could tweak from both sides.
Right.
Okay. And then after the Rogers, I went with the Sonar. And one thing.
Yeah, I mean, that's so smooth.
Yeah.
It always engages. You don't have to help it up from the bottom like a lot of strainers, right?
Exactly. And I learned, and I was totally convinced after I grew up in Detroit and I'm a big car guy. I did something I thought I'd never do. I bought a Porsche 911 Turbo S. And I learned that the Germans don't fuck around. Okay? And when they build something, it works, or they tweak the shit out of it until it's
Yeah.
perfect. And, I mean, you look at sonar drums back then, and they were head and shoulders above everybody else. And they're also 3 times as more expensive.
Sure, sure.
I remember the first Babinga kid I
Oh,
ever
yeah,
saw,
yeah.
looking at the wood.
What is that?
Yeah,
Unlike anything
it's like
else
a-
that was out there, right?
I think the drum kit was like $9,000-10,000 bucks
Yeah.
back then. You could buy 3 Ludwig, 4
Yeah.
Ludwig.
With cymbals and cases,
Yeah, right,
the whole
exactly.
thing, right? Yeah, yeah.
Exactly. So anyways, I went with the better throw-off with the hooves. I packed the lugs
Mm-hmm.
with cotton because the spring would rattle.
Right.
And it's something you'd never hear there. You got 30 grand worth of microphones on the drum kit.
Mhm.
You hear the spring rattle.
Right.
You know, and like, the thing with the studio is, when the tape's rolling, it's gotta be right. Show you how old I am, when the tape's rolling.
Right.
That went by the wayside 20 years ago, but it still sounds the best.
It does.
No, it has to be right when the red light's on. And people ask me, well, why would they rent a drum set from you when the guy's got a drum set? All right, well, you being in the drum business, you know, you sell this to everybody, 1 or 2 out of 10 knows how to make it sound right. And the other 8 pound on it.
Mm-hmm.
And once the head's all bent to hell, then they change the head.
Right.
You know, so you come in the studio. Well, I remember when I first started working in the studios, it was $165 an hour with a 12-hour lockout. So if you paid for 12 hours, you could keep your shit set up and come in the next day. Other than that, it was you got to be out by 7 o'clock because somebody's coming in from 8 to midnight.
Sure.
So, so the catch is, you bring this kid's drum set in, set it up, boom, the snare drum sounds like shit. So for 2 hours, they're trying to make the snare drum sound. All right, we just spent over $300.
Just trying to get it sound right.
On
On
the
one
snare
drum.
drum.
On one
Right,
drum.
right. But on the bass drum, oh, the floor tom rattles. There's screws that have come off from the lugs bouncing around inside. I mean, you'd be surprised some of the shit these people got. So anyways, it just became cost effective. And I had producers that I worked for, and they're like athletes where they're superstitious. And I had this hit record. That's a drum set I used. That's a drum set they used from then on. I've had engineers that had hit records with the same microphones, and they'd only
Sure.
use those mics, you know. And fine, you know, I played into that. So it was cost effective, and a lot of times my drums were better than theirs. And the tail of the tape, you know, and you know, you listen to it, you know, 15 years later, and this sounds good.
Yeah, so your goal was to make a drum sound as quiet as possible, it sounds like, with the least amount of ring, and spend the least amount of time getting it ready
Right.
to perform and play.
Right.
Yeah.
And a big part of that, and I have to, I mean, I don't want to take the credit, but the engineer. And a lot of these guys can, as you say in Hollywood, polish a turd. And these guys, I worked for it was a dear friend of mine, a father figure, a mentor to me, Al Schmidt was his name.
Mm-hmm.
And he just passed away a couple months ago. And I handled his gear for 31 years. And he told me, when they're recording, I don't want them to even know I'm